In New Orleans, where property is older than memory and every street corner carries an invisible ledger, there was a case that outlived fashions, governors, epidemics, and wars. It moved from one courtroom to another like a slow contagion, leaving behind stacks of paper that browned at the edges before they were ever read again. The dispute was not only over land, but over names, over legitimacy, over the right to stand inside a family history that powerful men preferred to keep locked. By the time the final accounting was demanded, the city itself had changed shape. Canals filled neighborhoods, rose fortunes, turned to dust and back into stone. Yet, the arguments remained rehearsed with the same careful contempt, as if time could be defeated by procedure and repetition. The end did not look like victory. It looked like a woman in late life, breath shortening in a damp room surrounded not by estates or heirs in satin, but by documents, creditors, and the faint, exhausted attention of a public that had grown used to her name as a kind of legal weather. She had been promised an inheritance so vast it could redraw the map of a city, and yet the wealth existed mostly in language title succession, universal legatee nullity, forced heir terms that glittered on paper while her own days narrowed into the ordinary humiliations of aging. Outside New Orleans kept selling itself. Parcels that once belonged to a single fortune were subdivided, improved, mortgaged, resold, then defended by men who insisted the past was settled simply because they had profited from it for decades. The paradox was simple and cruel. The longer she fought, the more powerful her claim became, and the less power she held over her own life. The newspapers called it the Great Gaines case, and reported it the way they reported storms inevitable, exhausting, returning on schedule. Her litigation reached the highest courts in the country again and again, a recurring spectacle of testimony about a marriage that may have happened in secret, a will that was said to exist and then vanished, and a child whose very legitimacy was treated as a negotiable instrument. By the time the struggle was old enough to have its own mythology, the city's business establishment had learned to fear her not as a person, but as a precedent. Every judgment in her favor threatened not merely a family of defendants, but a whole architecture of ownership built on past sales, comfortable assumptions, and the convenient disappearance of inconvenient papers. And still, the woman at the center of it could not step out of the story she had entered. She did not live to see the last ruling, and that absence became the final insult after decades of hearings in Louisiana courts and repeated appearances before the United States Supreme Court after the slow accumulation of victories that arrived like delayed telegrams. The decisive award came after her death, as if the system could only admit she was right when she could no longer be present to receive the words. The sum her heirs ultimately collected from the city of New Orleans was large enough to sound like triumph and small enough to feel like mockery once the costs were counted. The case proved that persistence could bend institutions, and it also proved that institutions could wait out a human lifespan with professional patience. Her name was Myra Clark Gaines, and the wealth she pursued was never just money. It was the right to be officially real in a world that preferred her to remain a rumor. Stories like this do not survive for nearly a century by accident. They endure because they expose a structural anxiety at the heart of power, the fear that legitimacy is fragile, that wealth depends not only on possession but on narrative control, and that women who insist on formal recognition threaten systems designed to operate smoothly without their consent. In the 19th century, law was the primary stage on which such conflicts were performed. Courts promised neutrality, yet they were staffed by men trained inside assumptions about marriage, inheritance, and female dependency that quietly shaped every ruling. A woman who pressed a claim too long risked being recast from petitioner to nuisance, from rightful heir to destabilizing force. Persistence itself became suspect, as if endurance were evidence of moral imbalance rather than necessity. The case attached to Myra Clark Gaines mattered because it tested how far institutions were willing to go to protect settled interests against an unresolved past. At stake was not merely the fortune of Daniel Clark, a prominent New Orleans merchant and politician, but the security of transactions that had already been completed on land once associated with his estate. If one woman could reopen a succession decades later, then every title resting on old assumptions became vulnerable. The anxiety this produced spread far beyond the courtroom. Bankers, developers, city officials, and buyers who had never heard of Clark's private life suddenly found themselves emotionally invested in proving that it no longer mattered. The legal system, which prides itself on finality, faced a claimant who refused to accept closure as a substitute for truth. For women, especially those whose status depended on contested marriages or informal domestic arrangements, legitimacy was never merely personal. It was economic, legal, and existential. The law distinguished carefully between wives and mistresses, legitimate children, and natural ones, with consequences that extended into every corner of life. Yet those distinctions were often enforced after the fact, long after men had benefited from ambiguity while alive. When women attempted to clarify those ambiguities posthumously, they were accused of opportunism, as though silence during a man's lifetime were evidence of consent rather than constraint. The Gaines litigation illuminated this imbalance with unusual clarity because it forced courts to confront whether the absence of documentation was itself neutral or whether it favored those who had the power to destroy, hide, or never create records in the first place. The broader question the story raises is not whether Myra Clark Gaines deserved the fortune she claimed, but whether a legal victory that arrives too late can still be called justice. Over decades, judges acknowledged procedural errors, recognized her standing, and reversed earlier dismissals. Yet each correction came with delay, so long it effectively transferred the cost of rectification onto the claimant's life itself. Time became a silent adversary, one that favored established holders of property simply by allowing them to continue living off it while the dispute dragged on. The law, in theory, corrected itself. In practice, it asked a woman to spend her entire adulthood proving that she had existed in the correct form. This pattern repeats across history wherever power, gender, and legitimacy intersect. Women who pursue recognition through formal channels often discover that the price of admission is endurance rather than brilliance, patience rather than force. Their victories are framed as technical rather than moral, their losses as personal failings rather than systemic design. In Gaines's case, the repetition of hearings and appeals created a strange public familiarity. Her name became shorthand for interminable litigation, a cautionary tale told by lawyers and journalists alike, subtly shifting attention away from the reasons the case refused to die and toward the inconvenience of its persistence. What makes this story endure is its refusal to resolve cleanly. The courts eventually acknowledged that Daniel Clark had married secretly, that a will naming his wife and child had likely existed, and that subsequent transactions rested on a legally compromised foundation. Yet, acknowledgement did not restore the years spent waiting, nor did it fully disrupt the economic order that had grown comfortable in the meantime. The law spoke in fragments, correcting itself incrementally while life moved in one irreversible direction. The central question, hovering over every ruling, remained unanswered. How much delay can justice absorb before it becomes indistinguishable from denial? Myra Clark was born in New Orleans in 1804 into a city where law was layered, memory was fragile, and legitimacy could be postponed indefinitely. Her father, Daniel Clark, occupied a position of unmistakable public authority, a wealthy merchant, a territorial delegate to Congress, and a figure embedded in the early American power structure of Louisiana. His private life, however, was deliberately less legible. Myra's mother, Zulim Carrière, lived in a world shaped by proximity without protection. Their relationship functioned socially as a marriage, yet it existed in a legal gray zone made more dangerous by Clark's intimate understanding of the very systems that governed inheritance and legitimacy. From her earliest years, Myra inhabited contradiction. She grew up close to wealth but not secured by it, acknowledged in practice yet left vulnerable in law. The environment of early 19th century New Orleans intensified this instability. The city was transitioning between French, Spanish, and American legal traditions, each carrying different assumptions about marriage, succession, and the rights of women and children. Daniel Clark navigated these systems with strategic precision. He provided materially for his daughter and treated her as his own in private, while postponing the formal acts that would have rendered her status incontestable. Security for Myra was experiential rather than institutional. It was something she lived, not something she owned. This distinction, subtle in childhood, would later harden into obsession. Daniel Clark's sudden death in 1813 transformed ambiguity into rupture. The will said to have been executed shortly before his death, recognizing Zulaim Carrière as his wife and Myra as his legitimate heir, was never produced. Instead, an earlier will governed the estate, directing assets away from the household that had lived under Clark's protection. For the child Myra, the loss was not only material but existential. An identity that had felt real was rendered legally provisional overnight. No declaration denied her outright. The system simply treated the missing document as decisive silence. The effect was devastating precisely because it was procedural. Her erasure did not come through accusation or scandal, but through orderly administration. This early displacement formed the core of her psychological structure. Myra did not develop the impulsive rage of someone struck by sudden injustice. Instead, she learned endurance. She learned that power resided not in confrontation but in persistence, not in emotion but in repetition. The denial she experienced was rational, polite, and devastatingly thorough. It taught her that truth, without documentation, was fragile, and that absence could be more destructive than falsehood. From childhood onward, her life would be shaped by a single imperative: to force the past to reappear inside the structures that had learned to benefit from its disappearance. Adulthood did not free Myra Clark Gaines from dependency on institutions. It bound her more tightly to them. In 1832, she married William Wallace Whitney, and the marriage marked a critical transformation. Her private grievance was converted into a public claim. Whitney became not only her husband, but her legal collaborator, translating memory into affidavits and suspicion into pleadings. In a society where women's access to courts was still mediated by male authority, this partnership allowed her story to enter the legal system in durable form. Power at this stage did not belong to Myra directly. It was exercised through structure, through process, through the disciplined language of law. The years that followed trained her in a new kind of education. She learned the tempo of litigation, the patience required for continuances, the importance of jurisdiction, the strategic value of delay. Lawyers replaced confidants. Courtrooms replaced domestic spaces. The case advanced, stalled, and advanced again, demanding from her a consistency that bordered on self-erasure. When Whitney died in 1837, the machinery did not stop. 2 years later, her marriage to General Edmund Pendleton Gaines brought a different form of institutional reinforcement. Gaines's national reputation and public authority shielded the case from dismissal as mere grievance. The claim could no longer be treated as marginal or embarrassing. It had become politically and socially inconvenient. Yet each layer of reinforcement carried its own cost. The more Myra relied on intermediaries, husbands, attorneys, judges, the more her agency was expressed not through control of outcomes, but through refusal to withdraw. Power manifested as endurance. The courts rewarded her not with resolution, but with standing the right to continue to be heard again, to correct earlier errors incrementally. Favorable language appeared in opinions, acknowledgments, without enforcement, recognitions without restitution. Over time, litigation ceased to be a means toward an end and became the architecture of her existence. What emerged was a woman whose identity fused with procedure. Her autonomy was paradoxical, sustained by systems that constrained her, strengthened by institutions that consumed her time. She learned to inhabit delay as a condition of life, to treat partial recognition as proof of existence. Power as it formed around her was abstract, cumulative, and impersonal. It did not restore what had been lost, but it ensured that she could not be dismissed. In becoming inseparable from the case that bore her name, Myra Clark Gaines completed her formation a life shaped not by possession but by the relentless demand to be formally, irrevocably acknowledged. Myra Clark Gaines did not ascend into power through inheritance or possession, but through disruption. By the time her litigation matured in the 1,840 seconds, and 1,850 seconds, New Orleans had already absorbed Daniel Clark's former properties into its commercial metabolism. Land once associated with his estate had been sold, resold, mortgaged, subdivided, and improved, passing through hands that relied on the assumption that the past had been conclusively settled. Myra owned none of it, yet her claim exerted pressure on all of it. The mere possibility that her succession might be recognized rendered certainty provisional. Titles weakened, confidence thinned. Her name circulated in financial conversations not as a person but as a risk factor. This was her entry into power, not visibility but consequence. Public awareness followed reluctantly. Newspapers described the litigation as vast and persistent, less a personal struggle than a structural anomaly that refused to collapse. She herself remained largely absent from these accounts, flattened into abstraction, while attorneys and judges debated her existence in formal language. Yet within legal and municipal circles, her presence was undeniable. Each favorable ruling amplified her influence, even when it delivered no immediate restitution. Power, in her case, did not produce luxury or admiration. It produced attention without intimacy, recognition without relief. The ascent was real, but it was austere, unfolding in documents and opinions rather than in rooms filled with people. This period also narrowed her private life. Decades of litigation consumed resources and attention. Legal fees accumulated. Interim victories failed to translate into financial stability. Social life contracted under the weight of obligation and expectation. The promise of future vindication justified present deprivation, creating a cycle in which endurance replaced enjoyment. Her power grew precisely as her personal world shrank. She was increasingly known, increasingly consequential, and increasingly alone, embedded in a public conflict that left little room for a private self. As the case reached the United States Supreme Court repeatedly in the mid-19th century, a dangerous sense of inevitability emerged. Favorable language accumulated in judicial opinions. Her standing was affirmed. Prior dismissals were corrected. The legitimacy of her claim was no longer treated as speculative. These acknowledgments created the impression that resolution was approaching, that the system had finally aligned itself with correctness and required only time to complete the alignment. Control seemed to exist not in outcome, but in trajectory. The arc appeared fixed. Yet, this control was illusory. Each recognition exposed the scale of what full enforcement would require. A decisive victory threatened to destabilize hundreds of property titles and implicate the city itself. Judges, conscious of consequence, proceeded cautiously. Remedies were fragmented. Enforcement deferred. The law corrected its reasoning while postponing its effects. Myra's confidence rested on principle. The system's hesitation rested on practicality. Between them, delay became institutionalized. After the death of General Edmund Pendleton Gaines in 1849, Myra faced the system without the symbolic protection of public authority. Allies aged or withdrew. The litigation persisted, but increasingly as a self-sustaining process rather than a march toward conclusion. Early warnings about time exhaustion and the limits of judicial courage were acknowledged and dismissed. To question the path would have meant questioning the meaning of decades already spent. The illusion of control survived because it was rational, because it was supported by logic and precedent, and because abandoning it would have required confronting a more unsettling possibility that being right did not guarantee being restored. The irreversible turn did not arrive as a dramatic misstep or a single catastrophic decision. It emerged gradually through a narrowing of acceptable endings. Over the years, Myra Clark Gaines was offered settlements that by any conventional measure would have constituted victory. They promised comfort, security, and release from the endless strain of litigation. Yet each offer carried a quiet implication that the story could end without being fully corrected. Money could be paid without an unequivocal declaration that her parents' marriage had been lawful, that her own legitimacy had been denied in error, that the past itself had been formally miswritten. For Myra, such closure was indistinguishable from surrender. To accept compensation without total recognition would have meant agreeing that identity could be negotiated, that truth could be approximated. What had once been resolve hardened into fixation. The case ceased to be a means toward restoration and became the only form of agency she trusted. Persistence replaced choice. Litigation replaced life. The longer she continued, the more impossible it became to stop, because stopping would have required acknowledging that decades of endurance might never be redeemed in lived experience. Her fatal flaw was not excess ambition or hunger for control, but an absolute loyalty to recognition, pursued even as time eroded the possibility that recognition could still repair what had been lost. The case no longer served her existence. Her existence served the case. The collapse unfolded without spectacle, governed by institutional gravity rather than scandal. Courts eventually affirmed the legality of Daniel Clark's marriage to Zulim Carriere and acknowledged Myra's inheritance rights. The principle was conceded, yet the consequences of enforcing that principle were too extensive to execute cleanly. Hundreds of properties, countless transactions, and the financial stability of New Orleans itself were implicated. The city did not openly defy the rulings. It delayed, negotiated, and postponed. Agreement replaced opposition, but agreement proved just as paralyzing. As years passed, the power Myra had accumulated through disruption began to turn inward. The system she had forced to acknowledge her claim now confined her within endless procedure. Public interest faded. What had once been a legendary legal battle became an administrative burden. Her health declined, resources thinned, allies disappeared. The persistence that had once kept her visible now consumed what remained of her strength. She was not defeated by rejection, but by attrition, by a process that conceded her correctness, while allowing time to complete the erasure it would not openly perform. Myra Clark Gaines died on the 9th of January 1885, with the legal truth of her claim largely established and its personal meaning unrealized. 6 years later, in 1891, the city of New Orleans agreed to compensate her heirs formally, acknowledging the validity of the inheritance she had spent her life pursuing. The payment confirmed the principle she had defended while underscoring its cost. Justice arrived intact, precise, and too late for the person who had demanded it. Her story lingers because it refuses resolution. The law corrected itself meticulously and repeatedly, yet allowed the correction to arrive outside the boundaries of a human life. Myra Clark Gaines proved that power can exist without possession, that legitimacy can be established without peace, and that endurance can bend institutions without saving the individual who endures. Her name remains embedded in precedent, while her life stands as a quiet reminder that when justice depends on time, time itself becomes the final and most indifferent authority.